this computer. Okay, so as I said, we're essentially trying to answer the question tonight, where to now, with the BELA Bill. I'm going to be speaking for 2 sessions, and then we're going to be handing over to hear some views and opinions, comments from some of the provincial associations. There will be a little break in between my 2 sessions. We'll give people just an opportunity to ask some questions, and then we'll be kind of an open forum to allow people to make their comments and ask their questions. And then we're going to go on to look at the issue of and then we'll look at sort of what are the next practical steps that we have to take. So to sort of find out where we are now, or where to now, we need to know where we've come from. So I'm going to just cover that in brief. I think everyone knows this most probably, but the intention was originally, so the first thing is the idea of a tsunami, and that comes from a comment made by the Director General when, after the public comment period by the DBE, by the Department of Basic Education, opened, and they received 5,000 submissions on the BELA Bill. He said, he expressed or explained that it was a tsunami of submissions. The intention had been to get the bill to pass either in the 5th Parliament or early in the 6th Parliament. We're currently in the last or dying days of the 6th Parliament. And so from that, you'll see that the BELA Bill has been significantly delayed. Home educators, who made up less than 1% of the compulsory schooling population, generated 20% of the 5,000 submissions that were received by the bill. And that really had the impact of taking 2 years to process those submissions, and then COVID hit. And so the BELA Bill, which was kind of the steam engine, which would be pulling along the policy and the regulations, the coaches got mixed up. So the policy came ahead, the BELA Bill is in process, there's work happening on the regulations. So the whole kind of issue has become messed up in terms of how the bill should have progressed, and mainly because of the public concern and the number of comments that were received. And then the Pestalozzi Trust consistently was putting pressure on the DBE from 2017 on the issue of lack of engagement with homeschoolers. And I suppose you can use the slogan, as people did in the public hearings, that the slogan of engagement is nothing about us without us. That pressure that the trust was putting on eventually led to a meeting between the minister and the trust. The trust put forward a number of legal opinions. Those led to the department agreeing that learners only had to register once. So the way the very original 2017 version of the bill was set out was that learners would be registering every phase. They would sort of lose their registration at the end of a phase and have to re-register every phase. It was agreed then, following the legal opinion that was given, it was agreed that the homeschoolers would register only. Well, it was not agreed, but it was the department accepted that homeschoolers would register only once, and that the rest of the time there would be notification. You just need to notify the department that you are continuing into the next phases, which is an interesting point that will come up later. There was then a discussion about home visits. A legal opinion was given to the department. Home visits were, the minister was actually didn't seem very committed to continuing with home visits, but it stayed in the bill. It seems that officials are very concerned about home visits, and we can discuss later why that perhaps is. There was also the issue of the penalty clauses, the jail time or fine for not registering. That was also raised, that it's inappropriate. And then there was a general submission that was made. In terms of this engagement, I think people will know that there was then a round table with homeschoolers. Eventually, that led to the formation of of joint liaison committees in all of the provinces, and also a regulations national task team that was set up, drawn out of those JLCs. Sorry, someone's got a mic open. And what I can say about what's interesting about those regulation national, what's interesting about this this process and the regulations national task team is that there's actually, unlike in previous sort of engagements with the department, in this case, there's actually quite strong larger numbers of homeschoolers are represented. And there's also the opportunity to get more homeschoolers onto that national task team from some of the provinces that aren't represented. So we can see that essentially the pressure to engage has been relatively successful or largely successful. The problem with the roundtable process, the formation of the JLCs and the regulations task team is that the BELA Bill itself has not been discussed in any of those. So this hasn't been really, there hasn't been engagement around the BELA Bill, but there is an increasing tendency to engage with homeschoolers. Just a reminder to everyone to check and switch off their mics. The other theme that's been, I'm going to try and see if I can just, sorry, this gets a bit difficult. The other theme that has also then been developed is, and people mentioned this also during the, sorry, I'm just going to try and find the unmuted person quickly and mute them. Oh, there we are. Sorry, now I need to go back. So another theme that came up during the public hearings was no regulation without research. And one of the key things there was the poor quality. Well, without research, you can't complete a proper socioeconomic impact assessment, a so-called SEIA, and so that represents a fundamental problem with the bill as it stands even now. But eventually the trust worked to provide research, its own research, to the DBE, which the DBE has also, interestingly enough, instructed the PEDs, the Provincial Education Departments, to do research. The Pestalozzi Trust, with partners and allies, has conducted workshops with the GED, the Gauteng Education Department. Karen has actually been very involved in that. Those have been, I think, very successful. And I think people who have been involved with that or involved with the Gauteng JLC will mention that, will explain that, or could tell us later, that it's actually had quite a positive impact among the officials. And they are, and I think that when home educators work with officials and give them insights into home education, then it assists we find that, certainly I found so far, that the attitude of officials begins to change, and some even become quite positive towards home education. So we can sort of say, to some degree, there's been progress on the engagement front. There's been some progress on the research front. So those are some sort of the benefits, or two things that have happened in the process so far. Then, of course, I think, and I was certainly very, very impressed. Well, I'll be with the public hearings process. I'll sort of come to some of that towards the end. But homeschoolers have achieved a huge amount in the public hearings process. So let's just go through some of the phases of that process. There was first the written submissions to Parliament. So this is distinct from the submissions that were made in 2017. These were the written submissions to Parliament. The Pestalozzi Trust conducted and then submitted a BELA Bill survey, which was a survey of I think nearly 1,500-600 home educators who took part, along with people who put in their own detailed written submissions, and people who put in, and people also put in submissions that were based on some templates. So there was, once again, a large number of submissions going in. And the conclusion of that was that people felt the BELA Bill infringed on the freedom of choice of curriculum or approach, and they did so by prescribing content and skills. There was an opinion of 86% of those who put in, and then by requiring assessment against the standard of the national curriculum, that should actually be, that's a typo, the national curriculum statement, or CAPS. That BELA Bill infringed on the right of parents to choose home education by requiring them to ask permission. That was 82% of people felt that. And it infringed on the right to privacy by requiring pre-registration home visits by officials. About 62% of people were opposed to that. So, of course, following that, the written submissions to the Portfolio Committee on Basic Education, there were then a number of certain organizations then were able to make oral submissions to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee. The Pestalozzi Trust did a submission, as did Learn Free. Gauteng Association for Home Education, for homeschooling, did a submission, and I may add, a very successful one. I thought Parliament was very impressed that to hear from kind of the people on the street, so to speak, the practical frontline home educators. And of course, we're going to have Gauteng Association also giving us some of their insights and their comments later on in the session. The Association for Homeschooling, also in cooperation with the Pestalozzi Trust, invited Dr. Mike Donnelly from the HSLDA, the American Homeschool Legal Defense Association, to come and make a presentation to Parliament. That presentation was actually so successful that ANC members actually were saying that they need to get on the same page as homeschoolers, and also wanted to and also considering at one stage doing taking their annual study, or usually it's about once a term, a study tour to the United States to have a better understanding of homeschooling because of the predominance of homeschooling in the United States. It turned out that because the ordinary schools, which they also wanted to see, were closed for the summer holidays in July, that they weren't actually going to be able to make that US tour. So, but I think it gives a sense of how much was achieved in those oral submissions. And then, of course, I mean, and I must say here that I absolutely never expected, within the realms of possibility, the major achievement that homeschoolers had when they actually went to the public hearings in the provinces. Homeschooling moved onto the center stage of the hearings. I mean, I think so much so that to some extent it became one of the major focuses, or I think some groups like the unions were so scared that the number of homeschoolers turning up and condemning the bill was going to get the whole bill thrown out, that they started to rally in their numbers later on in the process to try and kind of counter the weight of the homeschoolers. So homeschooling really stepped onto the center stage, politically speaking, during the public hearings. I personally thought it was going to be that homeschoolers would be important, but they'd kind of be sort of, second billing. They wouldn't be the sort of stars of the show, which they turned out to be. So I think that's a big thank you to all of you who were involved, who came, who contributed, who assisted, who helped, who've supported the trust over the years to be able to create the resources to be able to do such an amazing kind of, I think one of the most amazing sort of pieces of politics that I've seen in a long time. A lot of awareness was created about homeschooling issues. And I think sometimes we don't fully recognize how much has been achieved, because we had an official of the department, Mr. Ndlebe, saying homeschooling is a human right, and not in any way questioning sorry, I'm just looking for a mute here. Not in any way questioning the sorry, I think I've done that now, and not in any way questioning the right for home education to exist. So I think that I think is a huge achievement. And even the submissions from hostile people, almost no one said there should be no homeschooling. What really is quite interesting is that the debate has shifted into what are the terms under which homeschooling should take place. So going forward, it's quite important to understand what the government actually wants to achieve. This is some analysis that we've done as Learn Free. Not everyone has to agree with it. You may disagree with it, but and there is an element of guesswork involved in this analysis. So I freely admit that. I'm sorry, I'm just making sure someone's moved it again. But one of the, and as I said, there's guesswork involved here. We have to let Uda in. Which is important because she's speaking later. So one of the issues is there's a major weakness of the BELA Bill, the eventual socioeconomic impact assessment, the SEER that was done on the BELA Bill, and the overall DBE approach is that they haven't said what they want. So it's very difficult to understand what the motivation is behind the bill if you don't know what they want. But I think if you do quite a bit of analysis, you can see sort of what are the issues. Now, divided this up into a few areas, the ministry, the DBE, they want to, the ministry and the DBE, the government wants to meet their obligations to the UN and to report on the implementation of compulsory education in the country. And the argument for notification that's been put forward by a number of homeschoolers recognizes that. They also want people to be registered so they can have an accurate number of all the homeschoolers. They want to avoid court cases or being asked about oversight, both in terms of abuse and being sued for education neglect. The government's quite scared that at some stage, some person who's nominally being homeschooled turns up as a 17-year-old and says, I've never received an education, it's now your responsibility to educate me. They also want what's called articulation, the ability to move easily and seamlessly into the education system from homeschooling. And what that means is that they want people, and this is one of the major motivations behind people doing CAPS or being assessed against CAPS, so that those learners can easily be assimilated into the system. Officials, they want to be able to report on homeschooling easily and accurately. They want ease of monitoring. They want to be able to, so that's also why you don't want to do CAPS, because it's just easy to monitor CAPS. They want to be able to place homeschoolers in schools easily, because sometimes when they want to place homeschoolers in schools, schools resist that. And actually, strange enough, and some people may not believe this, but there are officials who are supportive of homeschooling, particularly in places where there's overcrowding of schools, where the schools can't cater to special needs. And most educators accept that if you've dedicated your career to education in any level, as an official, as an educator, in any role, you accept the essential principle that individualized education is the best form of education. The practical problem you have is how do you implement it? And so because people see the value of individualized education, there are officials who actually support home education. And then there's actually a political reason as well, is that the government actually, this is one of the things, Mary Metcalf's no longer in government, but she's sort of certainly made this argument that homeschoolers are amongst the most motivated and involved parents in the sector, and that they harm the public school sector when they leave to homeschool. So she's no longer in government, but Mary Metcalf's philosophy was essentially homeschoolers should stay in the schooling sector to make it better, which is, I suppose, a kind of compliment, but not maybe everyone is happy with the compliment. So what do homeschoolers want? Well, we're going to actually make available with this presentation. I'll make some comments about the presentation after we've had an opportunity for some questions. is we did that survey. There was the survey that was done, so we'll share that with you. And I gave you some of the key things that homeschoolers want. But the stuff that emerged in the public hearings, or opinions that emerged in the public hearings, were contingency oversight under the Children's Act. I'll discuss that a little bit later in the next section. People were still very strong on the engagement issue, that people wanted nothing about home education without us, that there should be no regulation without research. And there was a call for a freedom of curriculum and assessment clause, which would tie down the fact that the department has to grant freedom of curriculum and assessment. The portfolio committee so the next thing is to say, what did the portfolio committee ask for? The portfolio committee, after the engagement with the oral submissions from the organizations, basically had three questions. How do we make sure no one falls through the cracks? You could call that the Springs monster concern, and the education neglect concern. How do we monitor home education? And how does homeschooling contribute to social cohesion? Those who watched or attended the public hearings will be aware that this became quite a pointed and sometimes heated issue, where people were saying that homeschooling harms social cohesion, that it's racist, that is an attempt to create racist enclaves. Now, the portfolio committee certainly didn't come across, they were much more positive. When they asked this question, they were kind of asking, how do you contribute to the sector, to society as a whole? I think we saw kind of the negative side of that argument in the public hearings. And so the question really becomes, what now? And that's what I'm going to deal with in the second part, a little bit maybe shorter than I dealt with the introduction. But let me just open the floor now very briefly for any, because we have had a few technical difficulties. Let me just open the floor briefly for any comments, questions at this stage. So just pop your hand up, which I hope I'm going to see, and then you can ask a question. If you prefer to put it in the chat, we'll do that. I'll try and monitor the chat a bit as well. So any questions? I've been speaking for quite a while. Let me just give people an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. I do have just one housekeeping issue. Just please make sure that we can identify who you are, because eventually we'll have to kick you off if we can't identify you. It's unfair to everyone else who's in the room if we don't know who you are. Any questions? Karen, maybe you can just, if you see any question, you can let me know.
I'll do that.
Okay, Mariki Ukaman. I am recording, Mariki, if that's the question.
No. I just wanted to know, are you aware that there is any research being conducted from government side on home education?
So a great question. We know that a kind of order went out from the minister to tell the provincial education departments to do some research. How many of them have followed up on that diligently, I'm not sure, but certainly Gauteng has. And I know, and Karen and people from the Gauteng Association for Homeschooling and other homeschoolers and other experts in education and homeschooling have all been working with Gauteng over time to do research and to also do workshops. Gauteng recently did a workshop on special education needs in homeschooling, and they were very positive after that workshop.
Just a follow-up question, should we then put pressure on the Live from the Western Cape through the Joint Liaison Committee that the Western Cape should also start with research? I
must be careful what I say about putting pressure on officials, but yes, I think we should be putting pressure in every province to do research. And the experience in Gauteng has been, once you start doing that research, the lights go on for a number of the officials. I mean, in Gauteng, there's even been an official who's sort of just said, I'd just like to say in the meeting, I really like homeschooling and I really like working in the homeschooling unit in Gauteng. So, and working with homeschoolers. So I think when you have that research, once that research starts, you start, educate the officials start understanding what homeschoolers are speaking about. So any more questions? Because we have got quite a full agenda. And then we can move on. Ayesha's got a statement, so I'll just read it out. She says, the fact that many see it as a radical idea for parents to raise and teach their own kids with wholesome values, that this is a threat to schools, and DBE is crazy. And I agree 100% with you there. Let me just mute someone who's come in. Okie dokie. What if you aren't registered at all? Asks, I won't mention the name. What if you aren't registered at all? Thanks. I'm just not going to. Thanks. I saw your name. I'm just not going to mention it because we are recording. And this was just a little sort of interlude, and perhaps we'll delve into that in the longer comment section. I think that's really what we're going to be. One of the things that we're going to be discussing. What is the way forward? And we can then perhaps, and we'll discuss that perhaps in a little bit more detail. And also, just let me also say, if you want to reach out to the trusted leading stage now, you can also, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, but if you want to reach out to the trusted leading stage, you can do so. But please keep that question, and we'll discuss it in more detail when we open the floor for comments and questions later. Okay, so I'm going to just go on. I muted myself. I'm just going to now go, just more people coming in. Some more people need muting. If you give me 1 second. Thanks, everyone. Okay, let me go on to the sort of one of the main parts of what we're discussing this evening, which is what now? So part of the exercise that we've done is Learn Free, both with and for the trust, because we've consulted with the executive and the experts in the trust, is to look at the issue of where do we stand? Because what's actually happened is, and once again, I sort of can't really express how sort of impressed I am, because it's certainly something I didn't think was going to happen, is that the home educators have been able to secure a huge amount of political capital by the way in which they conducted themselves in the hearings, in the public hearings, in the public provincial hearings, but also before, in terms of their written submissions, in terms of the organization submitting. But at the end of the organization, maybe I won't say who said it to me, but but a number of the parliamentarians said to me, "That's all good and well. Your organizations have done a very good presentation, but let's see if the people in the provinces back it up." And the people in the provinces certainly backed it up. So the question then is, and so this is the fundamental question then: what do we do now with this, for want of a better word, well, political capital, but the political attention that we've got? And so what following this exercise that we conducted, we identified kind of 4 high-level scenarios, and and an honorable mention, and I'm going to go through that quite quickly. These, you could call these scenarios. They're not strictly scenarios within the normal idea of how you do scenario planning, but you could call them futures or future ideas. What are the next steps that home educators can take? And one of those is, given it the title, Stick to Our Guns. Home educators have things like split the bill, send the bill back for consultation and research, and all of these slogans, which are very good ones: no regulation without research, no BELA Bill, nothing about us without us. And if that scenario goes through, if that future realizes, what's essentially going to happen is it looks like the bill will go through largely unamended. Some of the, we are not sure what the committee will or will not consider. And of course, there's two phases. We still have the National Assembly, and then we still have the National Council of Provinces. But the idea really is that at this stage, it looks like there's a commitment to get the bill through, and it is most probably a low likelihood that that the bill will be split at this stage. If the bill goes through unamended, then what's actually happening legally is that any legal loopholes that exist to not being registered will then be closed. The bill has been very carefully written to close any legal loophole that could exist to registration. So a fully legal registration regime will come into place. Back in history, the departments, one of the department's consultants basically said to the department, and this is written in a document, basically said to the department, look, there's actually you can't legally enforce registration. And that's really one of the motivations behind the BELA Bill, to get registration enforced. So that answers the question that's been asked about registration. Under BELA Bill, once BELA Bill comes in, it's going to be legally very difficult to, and I would say practically impossible, to avoid registration. The option then is for people to begin a campaign of civil disobedience, to pursue an under-the-radar strategy, and if and when the department catches up with you, to fight it out in court. And what I'll just sort of explain briefly here is that the court, we have to ask what the court would give. That comes from the previous slide. And what the court would, it's very important to remember when you talk about the court, that the court is that Parliament is sovereign, and that the court is there to, a court doesn't write the best law. A court doesn't write law at all. What a court asks when it gets the law is this law constitutional? And that's a very high standard. What I can say here, I don't want to, because this is also being recorded, I don't want to make any predictions or make any statements about legal strategy here. But what I will say is the only part of the act that I see at the moment as being strictly unconstitutional and that you can be almost 100% sure will be struck down in court is, and nothing is ever 100% certain in courts, but being as it may, is the provisions around freedom of curriculum choice, because that's very well protected in international treaty obligations. It's protected in some foreign law, other foreign law it's not to the same extent. But I think that in the South African context, I can't see a court pushing through forcing everyone to follow CAPS or the national curriculum statement. Sorry, losing the presentation a little bit here. And I think there's a danger in this scenario or this future around where we kind of around this stick to our guns, is that you always have the Springs monster risk, which is that someone who pretends to be a homeschooler is an abuser, and homeschooling then gets a lot of very negative publicity, and then the court and then the department has all the law on its side and public sentiment to go after homeschoolers and force them and scare people into getting into the system, but then largely on the department's terms. Another option is to take is what's been called the panel beating option, to take clause 37 as it stands, amend it to try and panel beat it, add a freedom of curriculum assessment clause, hopefully try to get some concessions around home visits, registrations, and definitions of a competent assessor. The problem with that approach is that once you get this version of the bill out, The job is essentially done. The case is closed. There's no promise, or your opportunities for engagement going forward are limited, and any research research can't have an impact. And of course, essentially what you're doing here is you're compromising. And I should say that I'm not pro or anti any of these options or these futures or scenarios. I'm just trying to highlight the positives and the negatives from both of them. But of course, the positive here is the opportunity to get some protections into law. Then another option is to attempt to pass it down to the provinces. Section 51 of the Act as it stands is not really very, very bad. The problems actually are mainly in the policy, and it's very broad, and there's a large amount of there's a large amount of scope. There are one or two exceptions to that, but I don't want to go into too much legal detail. But in general, Section 51 as it stands, so this is not the proposed Clause 37, this is the section as it stands in the BELA Bill. If that section stays as is, or more or less as is, with a few points that I'll make later, that actually is a potential positive for homeschoolers. And then the detailed regulation of homeschooling can be passed to the provinces. And that's exactly what happens with independent schools. It's likely that there would still be some requirements in SASSA. It does afford an opportunity for a reset, which will be an opportunity for, which is an opportunity to kind of go back and in the provinces then bring in the research, the engagement, etc. There are positive clauses in the bill that we can accept, like there's an automatic registration clause if the department doesn't get back to you. And there's some small technical changes that could be made in a scenario like this. Let me just go on. The engagement structures would need to be set up in most of the provinces. That's a problem. As I said, there's an opportunity to present research here, but there is a very big problem with this clause. Or with the simplest clause, sorry, there's a very big problem with this scenario, which is that KZN and the Northwest currently have regulations that are in force. That the department, the education departments actually don't practically enforce those regulations. They enforce the policy, but this option would activate those regulations. It would make it apparent that those regulations have to be looked at. And those regulations are very restrictive. And then I'm sure everyone's relieved that I'm getting there now. And then we have the opportunity for, and then the last one, and this could be, this is a little bit of a left field idea, because people are very opposed to the minister having authority to make regulations. But this argument essentially says, leave Section 51. So we're talking about the homeschool section as it is now in the law in SASSA. Leave it as it stands, give the minister, take out, so you would essentially have Section 51 as it stands, make regulations in consultation, let the minister make regulations in consultation with homeschoolers. Now, this in consultation with provision essentially means that the minister, but really her officials, and the homeschoolers have to agree to any of the regulations. So these would be national regulations. They would bind all the provinces, but there would have to be agreement between the homeschoolers and the officials. This is also obviously an opportunity for a reset, because we kind of go back into the engagement. And as I said, Section 51, not Clause 37 as it stands as it is proposed, but the old Section 51 is a very broad clause. There are a number of positive clauses in 37 that we could adopt and put in, like the automatic registration if the department doesn't respond clause. And there's some technical changes that could be made. There is a national task team that's already functioning. If people go back to when we started speaking, there was discussion about, you'll know that there was this task team with quite strong homeschool representation. And then research can be presented to that national task team to shape the regulations. So that is essentially the four scenarios, the four key scenarios or four key futures. People may be asking what happened to contingency oversight under the Children's Act, and it gets an honorable mention here. But we didn't in the final analysis or final report seriously consider it, because the chair of the portfolio committee was actually so impressed by the number of homeschoolers asking about contingency oversight under the Children's Act, that she actually asked in a public meeting of the portfolio committee the Department of Basic Education's head of legal and legislative about it. That was roundly criticized. The head of legal and legislative criticized and provided what I would say on the face of it was a sound legal critique. But if people can come forward in our discussions and overcome that critique, there's no reason why this scenario or this future couldn't also receive quite detailed and careful consideration. But that just brings me to one last point about the nature of this presentation, which is that you'll notice that in the presentation, sorry, someone wanting to join. You'll notice that in the presentation, I haven't got a lot of sort of the factual details. This is essentially just the draft presentation, and we'll list all of these, and I'll give you and in the final presentation, which Karen's behind me with the whip, which will be ready which will go out on Wednesday next week. I will put all the references in, and then people who want to hear what was said, what the critique of the DBE was on the contingency oversight under the Children's Act idea, can hear that and see how they can respond to that. I think maybe what we'll just do then, so that is essentially me finished from this section. What we could then do is probably just very briefly, if there's any brief comments for 5 minutes, and then I'll hand over to the Gauteng Association for Homeschool Representatives. So any comments? Sorry, I know that this is a bit of an information overload, but you will be able to listen to it again and engage with it again. Please just put up your hand if you have a comment or a question. I'll also try look in the chat. And I'll just most probably also just stop sharing. Well, I'll leave it for a little while, just in case we want to go back on and elaborate on some of those slides. So Jennifer says the only option that is decentralized is the back to the provinces option. Is there any reason we would not want it decentralized? I think the major danger of the decentralization is that you would immediately throw two provinces back into a you would immediately throw two provinces back into their current regulations. But so that because they have regulations. So Northwest and KZN would go back to their current regulations. And those regulations are, Northwest is confused. The regulations are very confused. KZN, and you'll know that KZN has been having a lot of legal issues, and the Pestalozzi Trust is actually suing the KZN department at the moment. They have very, very, I don't like using the word draconian lightly, they have very draconian homeschooling, current on the law books homeschooling regulations. And the only reason the reason they've not enforced those regulations is that they're following the policy and they're waiting for the BELA Bill to come into force. So weirdly enough, in KZN, they are better off under the BELA Bill than they would be under their own provincial regulations. So let me hand over then, because you've been listening to me for far too long. Let me hand over then to Ud. I think, Uda, you're speaking on behalf of the Gauteng Association. So I'm going to stop sharing. I don't know if you need me to make you host, Uda. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Yes, can you please make me host? But I'm logged on with both my computer and my phone. So please make the UD profile host and not the UE profile.
That may be above my technical ability, but I'm going to try my best.
Well, you only have to pick. Well, if you pick the wrong one, then I'll just change it from the one to the other.
So I've got sorry. So which one must I make host? UD. Okay.
Yes.
UE or UD? Sorry.
Uniform Delta.
Uniform Delta. I must make host. Okay. You see why I'm not a pilot, right? There we are. You're the host now.
Okay, great. Let me see if I can set up my share screen. So I just quickly want to make a comment on the regulations to give you guys an idea of how bad the KZN regulations are. You have to be assessed quarterly by a school, and a school must accept the role of overseer over your home education, but nothing obliges the school to do that, and you won't be registered without such a school. So the practicality was, before the BELA Bill, that no homeschooler could ever find a school that was willing to take them on, and their application won't be looked at without a school being that overseer. So, and that's just the start. Like, it's really, really bad. Okay, when I was asked to do the presentation, I'm not sure. They also just speak about what we've done or our internal consultation process in the Gauteng Association, because before the public hearings ours was supposed to be, I think, in March, and then it moved on a bit. So we prepared quite a bit. So I wasn't sure whether I was supposed to speak about the practicalities of or the outcome of it or whatever. So I just put everything in there, and I'll run through it quickly. Okay, we are the Gauteng Association for Homeschooling, and the process we followed, like the overarching process, was we established our ideals. Then we looked at the road ahead, and then we drew a line in the sand and said, this is where we won't go far. So for our ideals, we thought, what do we think with the information we currently have would create an environment in which home education can thrive? And then we expressed these ideals in our written and oral submissions to Parliament. So if anybody's interested, I can look up the links and send those to you. Then we looked at the road ahead, and it is quite similar to the options we identified that could possibly happen. Is quite similar to those Kristen.
When we started from when we started with this road in 1996, there was a lot of antagonism from the DBE side, and I think we don't actually have an idea how bad it was back then. today with the friendly officials we have and the little bit of trouble we have here and there, but back then it was really bad. And we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go actually. So the ideal, I don't think we will reach the ideal now. It's still a long process. I think we're maybe halfway to where we need to be in changing the environment, in a sense. So, the idea is Rome is not built in a day. You don't eat an elephant all at once. You just eat it bit by bit. And it's not an all or nothing thing. So we looked at what options could come out of the BELA Bill and evaluated it according to, what would be closest to our ideal and what would be furthest, what would leave us furthest away from our ideal. And then we got together and drew up the bottom line scenario. Like, if we are pushed, this is where we will stop. We won't go further than this. Our ideals are in two core principles. The one is that home education is a natural extension of parenting, and it should be regulated as an extension of parenting and not as an extension of the school system. And then the other one, which is also in our objectives, is that legislation should allow the child to be educated according to that child's individual and specific needs. So based on these two, we have some detailed ideals, in a sense, that we would like to work towards. And I'm not going to go through everything right now, because I think we are running a little bit late. But for example, on regulations, we say only in consultation with. We say the home education should be regulated under the Children's Act. Monitoring and oversight should only be on a contingency basis. You can quickly read on the screen if you would like to, or I can also send it to whoever wants to, who is in the meeting and wants to see this. Then we identified some options. So I'm not going to go into depth because a lot of it was what Christopher identified. We just don't have when to do such legal detail, in a sense. But I think what is important is that we identified which options we would prefer of the options. So we identified the option that the section is rejected completely and sent it back, and we said that would be our first option. So split the bill. And in this scenario, the current section 51 will continue. And then we said our second preferable option would be if the whole homeschool section is rejected, but only subsection 16 is put through. And we get regulations in consultation with. And we said this because, well, for quite a couple of reasons, but one is that regulations are easier to strike down, as we understand it, than law is. And then our next option was that the home education section is passed with significant amendments. That would be the panel beating option that Christopher raised. And then the last one was that the home education section is passed as it is now. I think we have to fight it out in the Constitutional Court. And although we all have in the back of our mind that we are going, we may need to go to the court. We don't really want to go there, if that makes sense. So we prepare for the fight, but we don't want to end there if we can possibly help it. And one reason is that the court doesn't strike down just bad law, and there's a lot of bad law in the BELA Bill, in my opinion. But it doesn't strike down bad law, it just strikes down unconstitutional law. Okay, so and then the C, we identified our bottom line position. And this is like, this is where we won't go further, we won't cross this line. So it's very far from what our ideal is. But if pressed, then this is kind of where it stops. So we said assessment only every 3 years at the end of the phase, only in math and English, or math and any official language. We said such an assessment must be mostly skills-based instead of content-based. There should be non-test options. We spoke about maybe exploring only a pass-fail assessment, and then costs should be taken into account and get as low as possible. So practically, like the steps we took is we sent out a letter to give the executive's thoughts on the first 2 issues and stating the problem, and then we had a special general meeting where we decided, okay, yes, we need to plan for eventualities, and what are we going to do if this happens, and what are we going to do if this happens. Then we used our WhatsApp group to brainstorm and discuss and vote until we have formulated the preferred options and put it into order of preference. And then we explored the bottom line positions. So the bottom line positions would come in with the panel beating option, so C. So if our first and our second option doesn't work out, then what can we negotiate in C? That's basically where it comes in. And we explored the bottom line positions, the options, and we crafted our position. And then we put it together, the document with our ideals, our options in order of preference, and the bottom line position. And what is nice about this is that it gives our executive clear guidance for negotiations and taking quick decisions. So we already know if we step into a meeting, whatever, this is how members feel, and this is how, this is what we should fight for. And if we see practically this is not going to work, then our second option would be this. And that is it. If there's any questions, you're welcome to ask. You can, if you're not yet a member of the Gauteng Association and you're in the Gauteng province, then you're welcome to join us. We would be happy to have you.
Uda, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually stop the recording now so that people can feel free to ask questions on your excellent presentation and any other questions that they may have, make comments. The floor is open for discussion.